Hello, everyone. Welcome to Archeo Viking. Today is a very special episode uh, about a subject very near and dear to my heart and my two guests' hosts' hearts, and that is the Lord of the Rings and the mythological and historical inspirations that Tolkien used to create the Lord of the Rings universe and the universe of his related stories. Today, to help me with this beloved subject, is our two guest hosts. New one, Byron Eugene, or Byron of the Old Ways. Say hello, Byron.
Hello.
And then a recurring guest host, Beofeld, fellow heathen and historian.
Hello, hello.
So, Tolkien is most famously known for his creation of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, but he also created in the same universe, or in the same narrative universe at least, other books, including The Children of Hurin, which is a prequel, much like The Hobbit, but it's actually before The Hobbit, The Fall of Gondland, and especially a prequel, the Silmarillion, which is essentially the astrophysics textbook to the Lord of the Rings college algebra textbook. So while we will look at the Silmarillion and the Children of Hurin a little bit, our main focus is going to be on the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And similarly, we are only going to focus on the inspirations from Germanic and Norse mythology, and Germanic history and the history of peoples connected to the Germanic peoples. We are using this narrow focus because Tolkien took from a lot of different mythologies, including but not limited to Celtic mythology, Greek mythology, biblical mythology, and even Arthurian mythology. So we are going to save ourselves some sanity, and rather being here for months, we're going to be here for one day. So sorry if there are other mythologies that you want us to cover in a later video, please feel free to comment. As nobody is surprised, or at least some people might not be surprised, the two immediate things that come to mind are the elves and the dwarves, which, as Beofeld and I talked about in our last collaboration, were copied pretty much word for word from Germanic and Norse mythology, with the exception that they are actually sort of ambiguously, it's hard to tell, the same creatures. Sometimes elves are, dwarves and vice versa. One of the most well-known is a individual known as Wayland the Smith, who sort of is a combination of what you would think is sort of like a Germanic Icarus, because he's captured by an evil king and fashions a pair of wings to escape. However, Byron, what were those wings made out of again?
The bones of his captors, or people who had him captive.
Yeah. And he then he didn't stop there. He made utensils out of the bones of the king's children, and fed him some of the king's children. Yeah. And he was supposed to be, sometimes he's described as half dwarf, sometimes he's described as half elf, and he's the master smith of Europe. Not necessarily every weapon is made by him, but chances are if you throw a rock and you hit a magical sword in some sort of mythological textbook from Europe, it's going to be claimed that Wayland the Smith made it. Everything from Excalibur to Charlemagne's sword in the accounts of Charlemagne has apparently been made by Wayland. Furthermore, there's a thing called elf shot that has appeared in a lot of English texts. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Byron and Beofeld.
Elf shot is a pretty interesting thing, because it's intended to be an actual malady, right? So it's a physical ailment that someone would have come across. We see it represented in the Leech books, and the Leech books, for all intents and purposes, express it as an actual malady which someone could be afflicted with. What that malady is, we're not entirely sure exactly what Elfshot is intended to represent. There's some debate on the subject, but it does give us a recipe for an herbal remedy to alleviate the symptoms of Elfshot, and at the same time, a magical charm was supposed to be said over the wound to cover the magical aspects of it. So there was a medico-magical in its finest way. The remedy included, if memory serves right, plantain, feverfew, and red dead nettle, which is particularly interesting because these do not occur at the same time of the year. So you would have had to have collected and then preserved these herbs in order to be able to put them together, because they don't exist at the same time, which shows it's not just some sort of like hodgepodge conglomeration that you couldn't go out into the field and throw together. You have to know what you're doing, and then prepare well in advance for like an entire season to be able to get the things which you would need to prepare this remedy. And so there's a sort of deliberate nature to just the inclusion of these particular herbs that make it rather fascinating. But the Elfshot itself is referenced for being something which is harmful, that the mystical sort of spears and arrows of the elves would become lodged in a person, and you would have to coax them out with the herbs and the magical charm. And the same thing could be done in the particular Elfshot remedy that I'm thinking of. Is you could be harmed in the same way by witches and even gods.
That's interesting.
One interesting thing about those plants is their leaves all resemble arrowheads, and that's one note I found when I was looking into Elfshot was they thought it was because the law of similarity, where you use one thing to represent another.
That's interesting, and I've never heard of having to. Well, that's not true. I've heard of some, but not in Germanic culture, of having to, do it against possible attacks from gods either. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's just one of the side notes inside of the thing.
So it's just okay. And then other elf-like creatures that etymologically are similar, if not the same. Alps from not to be confused with the Alps like bordering Italy and Germany or in France, though that is where it comes from. But Alps are the male, or at least described as being the male version of a nightmare. Nightmare or Amara is a female creature, and they sit on top of the male and female both take on the form of a horse, and then eventually somehow through the night they sit on top of an individual like you see in this picture, and drain their soul. And Alp is etymologically related to elf, which is very interesting, and they were considered to be sometimes diminutive, sometimes big, sometimes in the form of a horse, sometimes in the form of a horse, sort of like an Usig or a Kelpie, from Celtic mythology, or a horse that will drag, somebody for the worst ride of their life, literally, and kill them. So, yeah. So all of this is what sort of how elves are a lot of times described in Germanic and Norse mythology.
So I've got a nice little pun for you here.
Okay.
So much for sleep apnea. How about sleep alpnea?
Okay. Jeez. So yeah. So that Beofeld and his puns and his play on words. Thank you for that. But yes, this is what Tolkien got the inspiration for elves from, and dwarves as well. Now we move on to the next more diminutive individuals that Tolkien wrote in his world. And if there are people who still don't recognize, okay, that's not true. There's got to be teenagers who don't recognize it, but most people our age, we're all in our 30s, who if y'all don't recognize who these individuals are, you've missed out on a lot. These are hobbits. I could have pulled up the old 1970s cartoon Hobbit version, but even less people would recognize that, though it's arguably better than the.
Oh yes, yes.
No, I enjoy the Peter Jackson versions of the Hobbits, but they are not very book accurate. Anyways, but in one of my questions when originally researching for this video is like, well, who did he get the inspiration for these from? Like, we know where the dwarves come from, but who did he get the inspiration for the hobbits? Well, a few places. One, brownies, also hobgoblins. They sort of are sometimes depicted as the same thing. And boggles, also known as boggarts, which are short, hairy people like you see here, who are very mischievous. Let's see here, how to describe a boggart. I'll pass it off to Beofeld and Byron again. How would you describe these individuals?
Well, I mean, it gets really complicated because the folklore aspect of it becomes extremely diverse depending on which area you're in.
Yeah.
And so and also as to whether they're good or bad, or
yeah,
and so it's extremely diverse. But the basics of it is that there's some sort of like being person-ish thing that dwells in or around the farmstead, and can get into to mischief if they're can get into mischief if they're not well taken care of, I suppose.
Sounds like a hobbit to me. So yeah, and I'd say that's sounds about right, because hobgoblins, now very few people are going to recognize this. I'm a nerd, so I recognize it. For the longest time, for me, Hobgoblin was only the Spider-Man villain from comics and TV shows. But they're actually more like little short hairy people who cause mischief. They're not actual goblins, which seem to be different things and seem to be more troll-like. They're more like, I would argue that they would be more like a Tomty or Nissi from Scandinavian folklore, is how I would argue. They are like.
They're similar to what a lot of heathens call housewives.
Yeah, Tomties and Nissies. Yes, yeah.
And like
Yeah.
Beofeld is pointing out, they're not taken care of correctly. They
yeah.
turn to trouble.
There's a lot about hobbits though that's also pent up in Tolkien's sort of like understanding of what being the ideal sort of like English person was.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of like just Englishness from his time period and slightly before, which is pent up in the understanding of the Hobbit. So it was transforming what may have originally been inspired by sort of this sort of like this sort of spirit-like entity, and then manifesting that into the real world, and then applying a very liberal layer of basically Englishness, very classical Englishness onto it.
Yeah, very Byronic Englishness on it.
Yes. Very pastoral and pleasant, and having lots to eat, and sedentary in a lot of ways, and not wanting to have the adventures and things like that. That's all very English.
Yeah, exactly. So so there you have it. The hobbits are inspired by several mischievous house spirits, as well as English sedentism, essentially. Now we go on to the Eagles. Everyone knows the Eagles from the Lord of the Rings. No, they should not have ridden the Eagles straight to Mordor.
Yeah, that would have been a bad idea.
They had literal armies there and giant dragon-like things called fell beasts. Fell beasts that could have taken them down. Like the way my mother and I were actually talking about this the other day over the phone, because we have the same beef with this, fan theory. It's like at the Battle of Osgiliath, where the Gondorian military are, while still being slaughtered, are still occasionally being able to fire arrows at one of the fell beasts and bring them down. It's exactly what would happen to the Eagles. So anyways, that ran aside. The Eagles are pretty straightforward. They're inspired by a couple of things. One, the eagle with a rooster of all things in between his eyes at the top of the world tree, who has has a literal eternal flame war with the dragon Nidhogg, who's at the bottom of the roots. And that's we don't really know much more about him other than that. He's essentially constantly sending letters with the immortal squirrel Ratatosk back and forth between him and the dragon at the root of the world tree Nidhogg, and they're constantly sending what is implied to be insults back at each other. So and that's really about all we know. But then we also have Jotuns, or Etons, who can take on the form of eagles, the most well-known and notable being Thiazi, the father of Skathi in Norse mythology. Now, as Beofeld and I mentioned in our video about chaos worship being historical, we don't think Skathi originally was a Jotun or an Eton. We think this was a later Norse creation, but it's still important to note because in that story, Thiazi took the form of a giant eagle to kidnap the goddess Ithun, who grew the magic apples that the gods ate, to become immortal. Again, probably later Christian creation, because, well, maybe also a little bit of Greek mythology added in there, but it sounds very biblical, golden apples from a tree, yada yada. So those are the most likely inspirations for the giant eagles that, at least in Germanic mythology, that we have, which is one of the primary mythologies that Tolkien used in creating the Lord of the Rings universe. Like I said, pretty straightforward. Not much depth we need to really go into that. Just the funniest part is by far always the fact that in Germanic and Norse mythology that there's a giant eagle and a dragon just constantly having a flame war for all of eternity for unspecified reasons. so and then here we come to Oathin. Who did Tolkien use Oathin to create?
We have obviously.
Yeah, a few actually. So the most obvious is Gandalf. Gandalf, the Grey Wanderer, the person who is actually, for one thing, that's actually one of the names I believe that Oathin uses, but is also the Grey Wanderer and such. And that's the primary person that that Tolkien used Oathin to inspire. The wizard who helps the party travel and fight off enemies. Again, pretty straightforward. There's nothing really to explain there. Because, again, as Beofeld and I mentioned in our previous video, while Norse mythology seems to have turned him into some war-hungry warrior, the Anglo-Saxon mythology turned him into the opposite, a Grey Wanderer, a traveler who helps people. So there is that. Then we have Melchor, also known as Morgoth, who is the sort of devil figure for Tolkien's mythology. But what's interesting is Melchor is actually a name mentioned in the Voluspa, where it mentions Odin's 100 different names. And Melkor is one of those names. So, and Morgoth was inspired by was the main antagonist of the Silmarillion. And then we have Sauron, who is the Great Eye of Sauron. There's really no need to explain that. He took the idea of Odin's great one eye and imposed it on Sauron. That's really it. And then we come to Thor. Now this one was interesting because I did not expect Thor to be in Tolkien's works until I did my research, and he actually inspired two individuals. One is the god warrior Orome, probably butchered it but I don't know how Tolkien meant to have it pronounced, who specifically goes out and hunts Morgoth's monsters and slays them. So essentially, it's like Thor. And then you have this individual to the right, Tolkien, who is the strongest of the gods and who actually defeats and chains up Morgoth twice. And as you can see in the picture, he is red-bearded and red-headed, or at least a dirty blonde. And there's not much more to that either. But we come to one of the more complex things, the ring. What was the ring taken from? Well, we have specifically the Volsunga Saga and Anvari's cursed ring. So, essentially, Anvari was. This is where we're getting complicated again because we don't. Sometimes it describes him as a dwarf, sometimes it describes him as an elf. But essentially, I believe it was Loki, wasn't it? Who pissed him off? Beofeld.
Yeah, I think that I get my wires crossed a little bit with this story sometimes, but I think that's right.
Yeah, and Loki pisses him off, and so he makes a cursed ring, and somehow or another his brother gets a hold of the cursed ring, and gets hold of the cursed ring, and takes it away for himself, and it causes a whole series of events called the ring cycle that leads where people get a hold of the ring and they eventually befall misfortune. And
Which seems to
then
be what exactly happens in the Lord of the Rings as well.
yes, and then another interesting possibility, though this is confirmed. The Anvari's ring is confirmed. The possible other thing that Tolkien may have taken is Draupnir, or Oathin's ring, that creates 8 more rings each night of equal gold and hue. And why this is important, because in Lord of the Rings, Sauron created a whole bunch of rings that he tried to trick and succeeded in all but the case of the elves, tried to trick them into wearing and becoming either really greedy, becoming his servants, or worse. And it worked really well in the Lord of the Rings story. Then we come to the runes, and this is where Beofeld and Byron are really good at. Which of there are 3 different main types of runes that you think of when you hear runes in Germanic heathenry, but one specifically is where they are taken from, and I will pass that off to Byron to explain which one was the most likely one he took it from.
Well, the runes on the map from the Hobbit are definitely from the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. Almost exactly. He just transcribed modern English using them for the map. And I actually did a blog post about that, because that seems to be everybody's favorite thing about the Hobbit, is the use of the runes, even though it only really appears in connection to the map.
Yeah.
But Beofeld even pointed out one time how, as a kid, that's what got him into runes was the Hobbit, and then him wanting to write everything in runes.
Yep.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm sitting here, I'm reading it, as it's on the screen. Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Druid's day will shine upon the keyhole.
Yeah. So it actually says that. It's not just
Oh yeah, it actually says that.
Yeah.
It's phonetically written, because the runes are a phonetic alphabet.
Wow.
And so you can read it, perfectly fine in whichever language you wanted to do it in, because it's just that the phonetics, or Futhorc, are particularly well adapted to line up to English for obvious reasons, considering the fact that it's the native alphabet for Old English.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, when my fiance and I were watching the animated Hobbit, and they showed the map, and I actually started reading it, she's like, "It actually says that?" I'm like, "Yeah, he didn't just make a bunch of squiggly marks. He actually used the Futhorc runes."
That's great. That's beautiful.
One thing interesting about the particular map is that it's not oriented north.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So you can see it in English at the top. It says east lies the Iron Hills.
Yeah.
And if you look at the compass, the M right there, that's the rune,
Okay.
which is the E. And then the P looking rune is the Win, or Wun, which is the W. So east and west, and then that would make north to the left and south to the right.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Well, one interesting thing I found out is that those 4 directions actually begin with the same letters in Old English as they do in modern English.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Because I was looking into it a few weeks back, and I'm like, Yeah, they all have the same initial letter in both languages.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. And hang on a second. Okay, so what we have here is a copy of the Futh Orc that we were talking about. It's the Beofeld and Byron can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's the most developed eventually of the three runic inscriptions that we generally see. There are more, but there's generally the three here: Younger Futhark, Elder Futhark, and Futhorc. And the Futhorc has more than Younger Futhark and Elder Futhark.
Yeah, the Elder Futhark, which is obviously the oldest from the name,
Yeah.
it's the oldest and was used with Proto-Germanic. It has 24 runes. The Younger Futhark was used with Old Norse, and it has 16 runes. They added more in England to the Futhorc because of the evolving language. It has up to 33 or 34 runes.
Oh, wow.
And the rune poem for the Futhorc is larger and longer than any of the other rune poems that we have. We don't have a rune poem for Elder Futhark. We just have a smattering of like inscribed bones and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
A few coins and metal pieces as well. So just a smattering of inscriptions. And what we know about the Elder Futhark is essentially gleaned from basically how we understand how it shifted into becoming the Futhorc. So everything that the Futhark knows, it gets from the Futhorc as well.
Yeah. And I believe you mentioned at one point and months ago in one of our many conversations among our heathen circle about subjects like this that essentially all the rune books that New Age people, which is a whole issue on itself, but the New Age people use the Futhorc for the Elder Futhark.
Right.
So
they just ported over the stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Because all the runes that are in the Elder Futhark are in the Elder Futhark with a couple of the forms changing where the rune looks different but still the same rune because it has the same meaning, same letter and meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Futhorc contains all of the Elder Futhark with extra.
Yeah. And so please, I still use the Elder Futhark for new heathens who are coming on, and a fellow heathen of ours who goes by Wolf the Red, who has a YouTube channel of his own. He uses it as well, but please don't get one of those rune sets that are sort of like tarot cards in there. The New Age movement is a very problematic movement that has a very problematic history. And no, not all of them. We know plenty of people who aren't, and unfortunately, Wicca is part of that, and such. And not all Wicca are like that either. However, they do have a tendency to not admit their problematic history. I did a whole video on it. I'm not going to go into detail about that because I've already gone into detail about that. But long story short, essentially they got a lot of their ideas from racist people like Madame Blavatsky and other people in the 1920s. No, they were not an ancient religion. Sorry.
Yeah. The same problem of the New Age sort of rune books is the same sort of problem that you see in a lot of the earlier pagan sort of like attempts, is that at that point in time, they felt credibility was rooted in the antiquity of something. And so they would make up a past so that they would be able to have a sort of like a credible religion. But what we've come to understand now is that you don't have to have an ancient religion for it to still be a valid religion. The Wicca is valid all on its own without having to lie about its past. In fact, lying about its past invalidates a lot of it, much more so than just saying, I'm doing this now, this is my religion.
Yeah. And it's like heathenry has a racist past too. We admit it. Not all of them. But we are fighting those people. They're called focus. But those of us who are not focused acknowledge the unfortunate racist early iterations of modern heathenry. Wicca does not, and they refuse to, for whatever reason, for the most part, acknowledge taking inspirations from people like Hitler and Baron von Ungern Sternberg, who was one of the inspirations that Hitler and the Germanic people took from, as well as Madame Blavatsky's ideas of theosophy, which are a whole complicated form of racism in on itself. So now we're going to move on to the other some more interesting mythological characters that Tolkien added into his stories, and those are the 9 Nazgul or ring wraiths. Nazgul essentially just means ring wraith, led by the Witch King of Angmar, the guy who, says in Return of the King, I can be killed by no man, and then is killed by the Hobbit and the woman, because they are technically not men. And then a character that only shows up in the novels, and I'm perfectly fine with them not including him in the movie because it didn't really matter necessarily to the story. But a creature called the Barrow-wight, where essentially the hobbits were told, don't go into those damn tombs over there, you will get attacked by a Barrow-wight, and then they do it anyway. And they barely escape with their lives. So
I wish that they had included that particular scene. It's sort of important for if I remember correct, that's where they get their swords from in the book.
Yes, that is where they get their swords from. So I'll give you that. But yeah, I'm personally fine with it. But yeah, it would have been nice for them to include it. But it still also doesn't matter to me much. But so where did he get the inspiration from? Well, the most immediate and most obvious thing is he got the inspiration for the Undead Nazgul and the Barrow-wight from J.R.R, the undead sort of vampire, sort of zombie, depending on the story you're looking at. Because in the case of, say, the Saga of Gregor the Strong, and the Saga of the Air Dwellers, they're sort of, the Draugrs are described as sort of being vampires who, if they, they can rise from the dead and possess people and do all those other fantastical things. But in the case of Osmond and Aron, it's just a zombie. So it just depends. But one of the surprising aspects for me that I found was that the Witch King of Angmar actually had a mythological inspiration. And that was the wizard Janibus from the Tale of Dietrich in the Black Forest, also known as the Necromancer, where essentially Janibus the wizard is described as this imposing, scary, ethereal monster person who is all black and who is leading a massive army of undead and monsters to lay siege on a castle before the hero of the story, Dietrich, kills him. And so it seems that Tolkien, being the master of literature that he was, took inspiration for his the general of Sauron's eternal armies from the Witch King of Angmar from Janibus the Wizard in Dietrich's legend. which is, I believe that's who's depicted here, is the wizard leading his army. So, and he's also depicted as a necromancer as well, which would make sense.
Yeah, this was actually, I think, one of the more accurate sort of renditions that he did for the essentially the what we have the ancient understandings of, because he did do a lot of tweaking with the elves and added a whole bunch, and he did a lot of tweaking with the dwarves and added a whole bunch, and then you have the separation of the elf and the dwarf into these very different concepts. But these guys, they would be completely at home within Germanic mythology with no tweaking at all.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything. It's like they walked straight out of the mythology into to Tolkien's work.
Yeah. And that's essentially what it is. And you know, one could even argue that there's no way to prove it, because these two are easily provable, but one could even argue that maybe Glommer, the Draugr villain of Grettir the Strong's saga, was maybe inspired the Witch King as well, because he's sort of like the most powerful Draugr we see in the Norse sagas that we know about. But we do know for a fact, at least within a very possible degree of accuracy, that the Draugr and Janabas the Wizard are who he took inspiration from. And like Beofeld said, like almost word for word, like ridiculously close. Because Draugr have been shown in like Skyrim and such to be sort of mindless. But again, you know, that's not always the case. In fact, in most sagas, they seem to be more vampire-like than anything. You know, very intelligent, not always conniving, but very intelligent and very imposing creatures who can outsmart you and kill you if you're not careful. Oh, and we do have a saga Hrothpraki where there's a sorceress who has an army of undead who kills a king as well. So there's that possibility as well. So, and here's another very obvious and very quick thing. Beorn, the shape changer, the bear man from The Hobbit. I wonder who he's based off of. He is based off of, one, the berserkers from Norse mythology and from Germanic culture and from all over history, but also he is based off of, going back to Hrothpraki's saga, two figures. Beorn, a person who is cursed by an evil queen to take on the form of a bear during the day. And also his son, one of his sons, Bodvar Bjarki, who can take on the form of a bear at will, though we only see him do it once technically. It's implied he can do it at will, to fight battles for his king, Hrothpraki, who is probably the same person as Beowulf and Hrothgar, and fights off his enemies. So these are again almost word for word taken. Beorn is of a family of shape changers in the north who are of a noble lineage. Bodvar Bjarki and Beorn are from a family of shape changers of nobility from the north. They take on the form of a bear and they fight armies. I don't know really what more needs to be said. Byron, Beofeld, do y'all have any more that y'all want to add to this?
Yeah, he did a really good job here of representing the essentially what do we call these, werebears?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
So he did a pretty good job of representing the werebears, but he did have a very tendency to sort of like take the magic away and turn them into something mundane. And he did this with a whole bunch of stuff. He did it with the elves. He did it with the dwarves. He did it with hobbits. That he took these sort of mythological and turned them physical.
Yeah.
And so here we're seeing Beorn not as being cursed or having, you know, sort of like magical abilities where it's like a spell or a skill, but as something that's innate, that he was born that way and that it's part of his race.
Yeah.
Which is sort of like a quality which is of the time period where Tolkien is operating.
Yeah.
So while Tolkien was very much against a lot of the sort of like the racialist stuff that was going on in Germany, he still had some of those ideas from his time period that were leaching into the way that he was doing some of his work.
Yeah, exactly. Which does not mean he was a bad person. In fact, there is a beautiful letter that I want to do an episode on just solely on Tolkien himself solely, but a beautiful letter where he essentially tells the Nazi party to fuck off.
Oh yeah, yeah. He was very much against the Nazis.
Yeah. So there's that. But he did even with that changing of the magical to the mundane, he did a fantastic job transcribing the Beorn family from the Rolf Kraki saga into the Hobbit.
Yes.
So the next things we want to look at are two legends from Norse mythology and Anglo-Saxon mythology, and that are the Volsunga Saga, specifically Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, and Beowulf, whose main character is the aforementioned Beowulf. So, who did he use these individuals to create? Well, for one thing, Sigurd actually created two different people. One, he was one of the main inspirations for Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Not the only one. He also used Arthurian legend for that, but again, we don't have time to cover that. But the other main inspiration was Sigurd, specifically the reforging of the sword Narsil into the sword Anduril, much like Sigurd's sword, father's sword, was reforged into Grom, and his retaking of his birthline, because in the Volsunga Saga, Sigurd had since been living a sort of a peasant life after the death of his father. Aragorn sort of was like that. It's a little bit different. He was, a traveling warrior who helped sort of find his way.
Strider.
Yes, Strider. But that was the whole idea, is he reforged his sword and to retake his birthright, much like the Volsunga Saga. And it, goes pretty much exactly like that. In fact, I would argue that Aragorn is much more like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer than he is Arthur. Personally, the Arthur does come in later when he finally takes the throne, but basically everything else is he's a monster slayer like Sigurd is. And then you have the other individual who is Turin, the son of Hurin, one of the aforementioned quote-unquote children of Hurin from the book The Children of Hurin, who essentially is a dragon slayer like Sigurd. And we'll cover that a little more later, because there's a very specific part that is makes him in the an aspect of Sigurd. Beowulf, on the other hand, inspired Bard the Bowman, who slew Smaug in The Hobbit. And he eventually became a king due to slaying a monster, much like Beowulf. Much like Beowulf became a king after winning a battle and slaying the monsters Grendel and Grendel's mother. So, and again, that's pretty straightforward. A lot of these are pretty straightforward throughout this video. They're not too complicated because Tolkien was not. It's very easy to see where he got his inspirations, especially considering his job as a mythologist. So, man,
I got some qualms with the movie when it comes to Bard, though.
They
did not do that sequence justice.
No. So, and then we go into, as we continue into this, Beowulf is also known for slaying and eventually dying in the same battle of a dragon. Essentially, a peasant sneaks into a dragon's cave and pulls out a gold goblet for himself, and the dragon gets pissed and starts burning things down. And Beowulf gathers his army because he's like, I'm like in my 60s now. I'm not in my prime. If I was in my prime, I could do this by myself, but I need an army. And then he goes there, and the army runs away anyways, with the exception of one, Wiglaf, a young squire. And so together they go in and slay the dragon, and he dies and passes the throne on to Wiglaf. Little side note, I've heard, recent mythologists, read some of their things where they try to claim that this makes Beowulf a crappy king because he, didn't understand his limitations and left his kingdom defenseless. I don't agree with that at all, because the whole point of bringing the army was he acknowledged that he couldn't do it by himself, and the army ran away anyway. That was the whole point of that. So that's a little side note of my own that it annoys me, that some modern mythologists have tried to do that doesn't make sense in the context of the story. Anyways, and then the other dragon slaying motif that Tolkien used was the slaying of Fafnir, the dragon who was originally a man who got corrupted by the cursed ring of Anvari. So much so that his greed turned him into the pure form of greed, that being a dragon, and he was eventually slain by Sigurd. So how did Tolkien adapt these dragon slaying stories? Well, one, Bard, Bard being the inspired by Beowulf, slays the dragon Smaug, and is part of a similar motif of Beowulf being granted the throne after slaying Grendel and Grendel's mother, and then winning some battles. He was granted the kinghood after slaying Smaug, the dragon that was constantly plaguing the peoples of the north, specifically of Lake Town and the Dale. And then you have the other dragon, who is, and yes, this image right here is supposed to be to scale of how big this dragon was. The dragon from the Silmarillion, and the first dragon, according to Tolkien's mythology, Glaurung, who was created by Morgoth to wage the war on the mortal realm. And Turin took the task to slay the dragon and essentially did the same thing that Sigurd did. He dug a hole outside of a cave and waited for Glaurung to walk across, and he stabbed his sword up into the gut of Glaurung and gutted him as he was walking. not a dragon slaying scene like you see in Dragonheart or something, where a guy with a shield is blocking the fire. And no, most dragon slaying myths were of people who were like, okay, it's ridiculous to try and fight a fire-bringing monster with a wooden table. Let's dig a hole and hide and kill them while they're not looking. And that's exactly how Turin does it, and it's right out of the Volsunga Saga. Like almost image for image.
I mean, if dragons came around like today, if they would sort of spontaneously reappeared or something like that,
yeah,
I'm pretty sure that'd be the most effective way to to kill one.
Yeah, exactly.
What's the old saying about discretion being the better part of valor?
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. So again, not much to say there. Tolkien, it's very easy to see the inspirations. And in fact, Beowulf is one of the main inspirations in and itself for the Lord of the Rings series, just by itself, not counting the other Germanic and Norse mythology. So, and Volsunga Saga is contemporary, probably being that most of the Volsunga Saga seems to be, as far as most historians and linguists can guesstimate, based off of the life of Sigebert of Austrasia, a Frankish king, in the Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, because it's their names are etymologically connected with Sigurd, and the story follows almost exactly with it, with the exception of the dragon slaying, because there's a lot of sibling killing and dick measuring contests in the Volsunga Saga that just don't involve dragons. So, and then we come into this, orcs and trolls. Well, for one thing, trolls, they're they're pretty straightforward. They come from Norse trolls. There's not much to hide about that. But what's an interesting thing for the orcs? No, orcs are not a mythological creature. However, the way Grendel and Grendel's mother are described in the literature is a phrase called Orkungur, which essentially just means monstrous, because you don't really know what Grendel and Grendel's mother are. They're just called monstrous hulking creatures that eat people. But Orkungur is where Tolkien probably got the idea for orc. And he probably took that and took the idea of Grendel and Grendel's mother and combined them into the orcs themselves, as well as the trolls from Norse mythology. So there is that.
I'll actually throw out that orc, it actually is sort of a mythological thing that occurs in Old English.
Oh, okay.
It's roughly equivalent to a demon.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
Yeah, its etymology is not actually originating in Old English. It's a borrowed term.
Okay.
And it happens to link back to Orcus, which is a god not in the Anglo-Saxon pantheon, but a god of the underworld, which was then borrowed by Old English by way of the Romans. And then the idea of orcs being sort of these subterranean sort of like demonic forces sort of comes through from that. And in Old English, you actually have a word, orcthurs, which is basically like giant demon, I guess would be sort of like what it would be, or a subterranean sort of like chthonic. That'd be it, chthonic demon of some sort.
Okay, all right. Well, that's something I did not know, and that's why Beowulf is here.
Tolkien said he actually got the name orc from Beowulf.
Yeah.
And you have the phrase Eotenas and Ilve and Orkneas, ogres and elves and evil spirits or demons. Is how it's translated.
Yep, exactly.
But he actually took that from the Old English of Beowulf.
Well, there you go. And I knew the Beowulf part, but I did not know the other Old English etymology, which is why we have Beofeld here, and also Byron as well, because they are more knowledgeable on the Anglo-Saxon part than I am. So then we go into the wargs, the giant wolves that the orcs ride. And again, this is very straightforward. One Fenrir, the giant wolf of the I'm gonna say it, Armageddon, because it's probably Ragnarok is probably just Armageddon copied on to Norse mythology. You can't tell me otherwise. But he's a giant wolf that supposedly devours the sun, but also what we think are his children, because and I'm not meaning Hatir Skull, who also devour the sun and moon. They're probably the same thing as Fenris, or Fenrir, however you want to pronounce it. But there's a region, according to the Poetic Edda, called the Ironwood, where a group of Jotuns who take on the form of wolves, and they say this is where the children of the great wolf reside, essentially. So there's that. And then we have another individual who rides a wolf, and that is the giantess Hyrroken in the Prose Edda, who just simply rides a wolf with reins made out of snakes. so yeah, they're all pretty straightforward. So, and now we're going to come into the last part, and this is going to be a pretty quick little part. The inspirations for the countries in Tolkien's realm. First, we're going to come on to Gondor, as well as the northern kingdom that's like considered a sister kingdom to Gondor, Arnor, or Arnor, or however you want to pronounce it. What did he base these off of? Well, he based them off of the Western Roman Empire. The whole idea is that Gondor and Arnor used to be these two titans that, ruled the kingdoms of the West and brought in a golden age of, human dominance, essentially. And then they fell and divided, with Gondor becoming basically like what would the Eastern Roman Empire would be, and not having basically still being a force to be reckoned with, but not being what it used to be. So like you see that in Gondor. Gondor is still the opponent who fights Mordor and is the first line of defense, but it's weakened from constant warfare. And that's essentially what happened to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire at one point in time was this massive titan that was on the verge of reconquering the Western Roman Empire after it had fallen, but then due to a variety of factors such as the constant warfare with the Sassanid Empire, which I'll get to in a minute, as well as disease and other things, became a shell of what it once was. And so it's not surprising that Tolkien would take that and run with it in creating one of his primary kingdoms. And then Arnor is based off of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, which was in itself a superpower that started with the lands in Orange, and then Charlemagne decided, went bippity boppity, your land is all my property, and decided to create his own empire, which not after he died, but after his son died, promptly split up into 3 different kingdoms, much like Arnor is described as doing in the books. Then we have Rohan. Rohan is very interesting, other than being, responsible for one of the absolutely best war speeches ever, Theoden's speech as he's about to crash into the army of orcs there, which I still occasionally watch by itself because it's so good. And that is the Goths and the Mercians. The Goths, because despite popular belief, a lot of Germanic peoples were actually horse cultures. Specifically the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths, who were known to be primarily use cavalry in battle, in which the Goths were actually well known for, and the Rohan took from. But also, one of the Gothic kings, actually a bunch of Gothic kings named Theodoric, is actually where Theoden gets his name. But also other names like Eomer, and Eowyn and such actually come from Anglo-Saxon names in etymology, especially from Mercia, like this helmet from Sutton Hoo, which, tell me this helmet doesn't look like one of these helmets from Rohan. Tell me that's not, yeah. So it's pretty straightforward what these are based off of.
Eomer actually was the last king of the Angles.
Yeah.
before they migrated to Britain. And his son, Echel, was the first king of Mercia.
Yeah, exactly.
And Mercia was the one Anglo-Saxon kingdom that actually claimed descent from one of the monarchies on the continent.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And then we've got another interesting nation, the Black Corsairs. Those black ships in the movies, for most people who have probably just seen the movies, that Aragorn and his army of undead show up on, and that Elrond is so afraid of, who are essentially a sea nation of various islands and archipelagos who specialize in piracy and in naval combat. And there's a few things that could be. And at first I thought, maybe it was like the Norse and the Vikings, but it seems to be not so much that, but more, he based it off of the Italian city-states, especially Venice and the Republic of Venice and Genoa, who were known for their fleets and were actually feared for their fleets, and in many cases, including the siege of Constantinople during the Ottoman conquest of the Byzantine Empire, were often called upon because not many people had fleets that were good enough to fight the Ottomans or other people. But also the Athenians, who were unlike the Spartans, were known for their very skilled and advanced fleets. Very well known for defeating the Persian Empire at the Battle of Salamis. And it should be noted that the Republic of Genoa and Republic of Venice their fleets were not against stooping to piracy. So those are the most likely people that the Corsairs were inspired by. Then we have Rohan, Vanian, whatever, the people of the North. Who were they based off of? This is pretty straightforward. The Germanic peoples, who were the people of the North. You got you can't tell me with names like Beorn and Bard and such, they weren't based off of the Germanic peoples. What do y'all think about that, Byron Beofeld?
Oh yeah, it's gotta be.
Yeah, it's gotta be.
Yeah.
So
not too much question to it.
No, not at all. See here. Oh, yeah, this thing. So the Battle of Pelennor Fields. The battle, which is, for those of you who've seen the movie, because it's only called that in the books, essentially it's this big battle that, happens at Minas Tirith. It is based off of the Battle of the Catalonian Plain, also known as the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, where essentially the Romans, with the help of the Visigoths, like Rohan, as well as other tribes like the Franks and the Alans, fought against the superimposing enemy, the Huns, who came from the east, much like Sauron's armies came from the east. And another similarity, Theodoric dies in the battle like Theoden dies in the Battle of Pelennor Fields.
Spoilers.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. But that's an important similarity, so you can't deny it. So you can't hide it.
No.
Yeah.
No. So, and then we have one of the last two things to look at. And actually, hang on a second. Okay, and so one of the last armies that that Tolkien used, it got inspirations from, are an interesting group he describes as the Easterlings. These are these individuals who come from the Far East and who seem to be a horse culture similar to Rohan, but seem to be, slightly different. They're described similar, like this. They seem to have more scale mail-like armor or scale armor, and more angular helmets that seem to cover more of the face, and their horses are covered completely in armor. So the question is, who are these based off of? Well, they're based off of a few things. One of the main ones is right here, The Huns. The Huns were the ever-present steppe enemy of the Roman Empire. And of course, China first, but China defeated them for the most part and drove them west, where they intermarried with other tribes and became even more of a threat to Europe. And they were, in fact, the people that the Visigoths, Franks, and Romans fought at the Battle of Catalaunian Plain. But also the idea of Eastern cavalry culture, of an Eastern culture that, you know, relied mainly on cavalry, the Mongols immediately come to mind, because that's what the Mongols were. And the Mongols definitely conquered a good chunk of Europe when they came on the world stage. They eventually stopped, mainly because Europe didn't provide any reason for them to invade. They could have certainly done it, and anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about, because because let me put it this way, in the words of one of the leading Mongol experts, Dr. Timothy May, all the arguments were like, oh, the Mongols couldn't have conquered Europe because of castles. Castles posed a problem. Well, fortresses didn't pose a problem to them in any other nation they invaded, so why would castles pose a problem? Oh, it's all the forests that were in Europe. China is a heavily forested area too. Didn't pose any problem to them. Oh, you know, they the winter and the logistics. Have you seen Mongolia and Siberia? You know, basically everything they argue can be debunked, and has been debunked by leading Mongol experts. So, and that certainly would have been noticed upon by Tolkien. The Mongols were, you know, the scourge from the east, well into the late Middle Ages. And then there was also the Sasanian Empire, who were known for their Eastern cavalry that wore scale mail in similar thing. In fact, you can look right here in the center, and that looks very similar to how the Easterlings are described. So we have three different groups that could have been based off of. And you see that here with the Empire of Attila, as well as an offshoot of Hunnic Empire, the Avars, who are very interesting because Charlemagne is the one who eventually had to put them down, and they remained a threat for centuries until Charlemagne came along. So they're equally a possibility for who the Easterlings are based off of, because it took somebody like Aragorn, who, if you read the Unfinished Tales, sort of becomes a Charlemagne-esque figure later on, and he invades the Easterlings. And, you know, you can see the Mongols and other Turkic tribes who are also similar to the Huns right here, the Khazars, who are possibly based off of, all who have a similar military makeup to the Huns. But the Huns are probably the main ones, but it's important to note that all Eastern nomadic tribes fall in that same category, as well as the Sassanid Empire, because the Sassanid Empire was the other big boy on the block that constantly was a thorn in Rome's side, and Rome never really succeeded in conquering them. To be fair, neither did the Sassanid Empire in conquering Rome, but that sounds like almost exactly like what Gondor was going through. So, and then the last group, the Haradrim, or Near Harad, the people who you see show up on the elephants, you know, who eventually, you know, attack Gondor and such, that Sam and Frodo are like, essentially, wow, Oliphants. That's who they're based on. That's who they're talking about. So who do you think they're based off of? The Byron, Beofeld, do y'all want to give a guess what historical groups they were possibly based off of?
My guess would be the Carthaginians.
Well, that's a possibility. What about you, Beofeld?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can be going on with these.
yeah.
The elephants though are pretty key in this.
Well, y'all are both right, but also wrong, and I'll show you why. Because we have two big boys on the block around this time: the Caliphate of Cordoba, or the Moors, who did use some elephants in their combat. Especially, from around this area, and also the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Both very powerful figures who show up in the late Middle Ages and who were formidable threats, as well as the Carthaginians. So you have several different people he took, but they're all essentially from Africa, because that's who in medieval literature was associated with elephants. Yeah, India could be a little bit, but that's too far away for Europeans. You have, in place of that, people from Egypt and more controlled Spain, and of course Carthage. So, and that's pretty straightforward. There's not much really to say to that. But what makes this connected to Germanic culture is because the Moors actually tried to invade Frankish, Germanic France, the Franks, before being defeated by Charles Martel. And then eventually his grandson Charlemagne tried to invade Spain. It didn't really go well. Anybody who's read the story of Roland and his death, who was a commander of Charlemagne, supposedly that's where Roland died. In a ambush that ended with most people being killed, and Roland basically holding the line so that Charlemagne and the rest of his forces could get away. So that's with the connection with Charlemagne's empire to Gondor and such. That's why it seems important. Seems likely that the Moors of Spain and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which was connected to all Christendom, including France, are the most likely scenarios. Any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, that does make perfect sense.
Yeah.
I was mainly thinking because of the big Rome Carthaginian wars. Well, I was thinking the Carthaginians, but when you put in context like that, it does make a lot more sense.
Well, there's that too, but also you have to remember the Byzantine Empire fought with the Moors of Spain because they were conquering. Basically, when the Umayyad Caliphate was conquering across North Africa, they took all that from the Byzantine Empire. So, yeah. So, and that's essentially that. And as you see, there was a lot that we covered, and that still wasn't even scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a lot more to be seen. But it's just that makes Tolkien's ability to create an entire universe this complex all that much more amazing. But with this, I hope we've revealed to the layperson, one, the history that Tolkien used, but also two, more of the Germanic mythology and heathenry that he used in his storytelling, especially for new heathens who maybe find the sagas or other works inaccessible. Because in the words of another fellow member of our heathen community, Ocean Keltoy, who also has a YouTube channel, going through the sagas can be a bit of a slog. They get kind of monotone after a while. There's only so many, such and such, son of such and such, brother of such and such, who killed such and such, repeat the process, So
I think that Tolkien's influence on heathenry cannot be overstated,
No.
just because he has made the different mythologies and all that more accessible, like you said.
Yeah.
And especially with Anglo-Saxon heathenry, Beowulf seems to be like everybody's favorite among Anglo-Saxon heathens. And Tolkien, that was one of Tolkien's biggest influences, was Beowulf.
Yeah.
Because other than Lord of the Rings, the thing Tolkien was best known for is his essay and his lectures on Beowulf.
Yeah. And then also, you know, a lot of people don't realize this, but he did his own translation of one Beowulf, but also of the Volsunga Saga of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. So, so that's one of those things where it's like it's very obvious where he got some of his inspirations from. In fact, that image of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer is the cover of Tolkien's translation. So,
You know, one of the things that I think that people sort of take for granted, even within heathen spaces, and definitely within literature spaces, is that we're so used to thinking of Tolkien as an author,
yeah,
that a lot of times we forget that he was a scholar and a professor,
yeah,
and that he was one of the most foremost scholars of Old English. And being a preeminent scholar of Old English, he would have been well understanding of the worldview of the Anglo-Saxons and other Germanic peoples around.
yeah,
And so Tolkien as a scholar is really one of the things that we have to sort of like approach these works as, because they are a glimpse into his understanding, albeit through the lens of his time period and through his understanding.
Exactly. And yes, and he's not 100% perfect. And you know, unfortunately, as Beofeld mentioned earlier in the video, unfortunately, some of the cultural biases, not his personal biases, but the cultural biases of his time did leach in.
And you get a bunch of the Christianity seeping in too.
Yes, of course.
Was unwilling to give up the idea of a supreme deity.
Yeah, he's unwilling to do that, and that's a whole nother subject. That's again, that's one of those mythology things that we were not able to cover, because that subject alone, the Christian mythology within the Lord of the Rings, is a whole nother complicated video. But yes, exactly that. Yeah, there is that, and also the you know, the antagonism of the East, the antagonism of peoples from the East. You know, they are the villains in his story, which, you know, he was not racist at all, but that's, you know, and that's something you see in the mythology. Attila was turned into a villain in the Volsunga Saga, and the Nibelung, and he was a Hun. The Avars were an ever prominent presence in early medieval scholarship, in early medieval records. The Sassanid Empire. It said, you know, the East, the Moors, even, you know, to the south. You know, the South and the East were these people who were coming to conquer you were coming from in the medieval era, where Tolkien got a lot of his inspiration from. And also, unfortunately, at the time, where, you know, things like theosophy and other things were borrowing Eastern mysticism, you know, and picking and choosing and such as well. So unfortunately, that got mixed in too. But he wasn't a racist. It's just that was what was in medieval literature and the culture at the time. So that unfortunate byproduct is East bad, people of the East bad, people of the West good. And so long as you understand that was not his, intention, it's just how that story came out, you'll be fine. It's a narrative trope from those times. So, Beofeld, Byron, do y'all have anything else y'all want to add before we end the video?
Just that one of the things that Tolkien was attempting to do was to create an English narrative. And so we have to sort of put this into the context of that as well, that he wanted to create an English mythology. And that this is in effect his attempt at that, because the Anglo-Saxons didn't leave us anything besides like fragments and Beowulf and a whole bunch of magical spells.
Yeah.
So,
and a few names like Thor and Woden and things like that.
so this is an attempt, and one that was very much a product of its time, and a product of its culture, and it's a good attempt, but obviously not done with it became literature. And so it was not done with the rigors of, say, attempts at true reconstruction.
No.
There was a lot of artistic license.
Yes, exactly. Which, that happens in mythology, in history as well. A good example of this would be, say, the Aeneid, where it was essentially
fan fiction.
It was fan fiction, and it was also an attempt, to be fair, it was also propaganda and an attempt to justify the very recent destruction of Carthage. So,
hey, Carthago delinda est.
Yeah.
we also got the same thing with Snorri and his
Troy.
Edda,
Troy.
because he was trying to synthesize a cohesive narrative from all these different fragmentary myths that were going around in his time. And so we get the same thing with the Prose Edda.
Yeah, with the whole Troy thing, and same thing with the Gesta Norm and Saxo Grammaticus. Though I will always have a particular annoyance with that, specifically the whether or not Thor's hammer can be fucking broken by a mortal of all things. That is for those of you watching, that is a qualm I have brought up over and over again and will always bring up till the end of damn time. I use the Gesta Danorum. It is a good source, for what it is. It's just, it's annoying even more than the Eddas, because at least because Saxo is very overt and trying to turn the gods into charlatan humans who are just tricking our poor, not knowing better, ignorant ancestors who are somehow also immortal and, appear centuries apart from it's a whole thing. So
yeah.
So it's a whole video on its own as well. Okay, so with that, we are going to end the video. Hope everyone enjoyed this not deep dive, unfortunately. I would still say very, very minor dive, which says a lot, again, about Tolkien's creation of of an English mythology, into the Lord of the Rings and the Germanic myth and Norse mythology that inspired much of the Lord of the Rings, as well as the history that inspired it. And I hope y'all liked it. And if you have any other subjects you want to see, whether you want to see us cover the Celtic inspirations or anything like that, feel free to comment, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.